Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. As indicated, I will indeed present some of the findings of our ISAC project. I myself work at VIA's Institute in Brussels, and this project was a joint cooperation with several other research institutes in Europe. Yeah, you can see them on the slide. So we cooperated with Polis, the network organization for cities in Europe and globally as well. TUI in Norway, Technical University of Dresden, SWOF in the Netherlands, and of course ourselves. The funder of the project was CEDAR, the Conference of European Directors of Road. And basically the idea of the ISAC project was that we wanted to stimulate active modes, but without compromising road safety. This is of course very important because we don't want to stimulate people to do something dangerous. So the idea behind ISAC is that we try to stimulate walking and cycling mainly, while at the same time making sure that it doesn't compromise safety and if possible even improves the safety. And our project consists of two main parts, and I'm going to show you some information on both of them. The first thing we did, and which might be most applicable for you, is that we have developed a web tool called Pet Bike Planner, which can provide tailor-made information to cities and municipalities. So it's basically a database of more than 50 different measures you can take to stimulate walking and cycling. And we provide, the scientific evidence there is, what the effect of the measures will be, what effects it will have on road safety, and so on. But the tool is intelligent in a way that you can insert some variables, some information of your own municipality, of your own city. And based on that, the tool will make a ranking of which measures will be most promising for your own municipality or your own city. So that will be the first part. And then afterwards, I will present you some of the main findings of a large behavioral survey we did in 9 European cities. So to begin with, the Pet Bike Planner web tool. So it's completely freely available online on any internet-enabled device. So if you like to follow on your phone or on your laptop, that's fine. So it's just a website, petbikeplanner.eu. And I'm going to go to that as well. Is this one? Okay, this one is working as well. That's very convenient. So this is just the starting page of the tool. And when we click the tool, we immediately come to the point where we can decide on how we want to use the tool. So as I indicated, the core of the tool is that you have more than 50 different measures that you can take to improve walking and cycling. We have provided all the relevant information on those measures in fact sheets. And there are basically 3 different ways that you can use the tool. The bottom one is, of course, the most obvious one. If you click all measures, you will just get a list of all the different measures, and you can browse through all of them, to see if there's something new for you or a specific measure that seems interesting to you, just if you want to explore and browse the content of the whole tool. You can also use the quick suggestions menu. I'll quickly open it. And then you can see that we have added some labels to measures. So, for instance, we have added on what level it works. Does it work on the level of the whole city, or just a neighborhood, or just a single location? You can also quickly go to only the high impact elements. Of course, there are different sizes of measures that you can take. Some of them can have very big impacts. Some of them are small measures, but can also be very relevant. You can go just with the low-cost measures. You can go with measures that not only improve mobility, but also at the same time road safety, and so on. So very different labels that you can access to quickly go to a specific type of measures that you might be interested in. But the most interesting feature is the recommended measures feature. where you can get tailor-made advice for your city or your municipality. So if we go to this functionality, then you can see that we have two options. We can either start with a new city or we can load a city from the database. If we want to add a new city, that's fine. You will just get a very easy menu, a couple of information, a few variables of the city that you need to fill in. So just to give a general description of what kind of city or municipality you are. And this seems very complicated and elaborate, but basically it's not. It just has 3 different levels for each variable. So usually it will be quite convenient to just fill out most of the information even without having to look up much of the information. For slightly bigger cities, unfortunately I know Luxembourg is not very, how should I say? There are not so many big cities in Luxembourg, so there are not so many cities from Luxembourg that are present in our database. But there is a database, we link to an existing European database with more than 1,000 cities, and for those cities we have all the data readily available. So if we go, I'm not going to create a new city now because that will take a bit of time. I will just go with the city of Luxembourg because I know for sure that it's in our list. So then we can just select it from the list. Let's see, Luxembourg. Okay, there it is. And as mentioned, as you can see, it will automatically fill in all the data about the city of Luxembourg that are available. You can see that there is also some data that is not available, the fields in orange. So we can now do 2 things. Either we say, okay, I'm in a hurry, I want to go on with the information that we have, and that's fine. I mean, the data can handle, the tool can perfectly handle missing data. So, but if we want to refine it, then we can try to add more information. For instance, it's quite convenient to add the size of the population because we know that Luxembourg has slightly over 50,000 inhabitants, so I'm going to indicate this. And then we can move on. So there is also, we can also add information on the current modal split. For Luxembourg, unfortunately, that is not available. And that also means that the next screen will not be very informative because this screen is kind of like a teaser to tell you how well you are doing in comparison with all the other European cities in terms of walking and cycling share. But of course, because Luxembourg doesn't have that, we don't know where we rank in terms of that. But it's also a nice feature if you want to compare or benchmark your own municipality with other cities, it can be informative. Okay, and if I click now to measures, then we get to the list of measures that are specifically recommended for the city of Luxembourg. So it's a ranking. So the ones that are at the top are the ones that are considered most important. And as we go down, these are measures that are considered less and less relevant for the city of Luxembourg. And we have a distinction between cycling and walking measures, of course. And you get some, some very quick information already here. So, of course, the title of a measure. So facilities to take bicycles on board of public transport. Just by the title, you probably can imagine a bit about that. There are a couple of labels attached to it, which you could use as quick access tools to get to such measures, and some indications, a bit like TripAdvisor, like of effect and cost of the measure. If you put on the magnifying glass, then you will open the fact sheet, which contains all the information. And the idea is that we give you the information in a layered format. First, of course, you have the title, and based on that, sometimes you can already decide, okay, this is interesting for me, or maybe it's not. If you open it, you get first this very short summary, like 5 or 10 sentences, to give a very brief explanation of what the measure is and what it does. And if you're then interested, then you can browse more and more into detail into the fact sheet. So these are not elaborate reports. These are fact sheets with the most important basic information, usually 3 to 4 pages in total. For smartphone friendliness, we have these in drop-down menus now. But I mean, if you just prefer to see it as a full text, you can just download it as a PDF or read it as a PDF. You can also email it to yourself, and so on. So all the fact sheets basically have the same structure. You get this very short summary, of course. Then you get an introduction with more explanation on the measure. You get the details on the scientific evidence that we found on the measure. So what kind of effects have we found in scientific literature to get an idea of what you might expect from it. There are some examples of use. We also provide information on the safety and security effects of measures. Of course, not all mobility measures have a direct effect on safety and security. Some do, some don't. Like taking your bike on public transport does not immediately benefit safety or security, so that's very little details here. And some challenges and opportunity you need to take into account. And of course, also very interesting references where you can find more information if you're interested. Because of course, there is a limit to what we can offer you on a fact sheet of 3 or 4 pages. And if you want to learn more, if you want some more detailed implementation guidelines, etc., these can be found in the references. So that's part of this layered way of providing you with the information. So, and for walking, it's the same. For instance, for the city of Luxembourg, lighting for pedestrians is considered one of the most promising measures. Together also with interim design strategies, for instance. What are interim design strategies? Of course, if you want to take a measure, I don't know, maybe like closing a road or something, there can be quite strong opposition by people for some reasons. And sometimes it helps to first do it as like a pilot project, that you first say, okay, as a pilot, we're going to close this road for just a couple of weeks or a couple of months. We will see what happens, if it's really a disaster for your shop, as you say, or whatever. And then afterwards, you will evaluate. And if you see that the effects are positive, this will, of course, help you to create support to make this a permanent measure. And so on and so on. So this is basically the idea behind the tool, that you are provided with information that is relevant for a city with the characteristics that you have inserted. So for a city like yours. Of course, there are limits to the amount of detail that we could include. I mean, if we had infinite resources, we could, of course, ask, we could develop an infinitely complex tool and ask you for infinitely complex input, and then this would basically be a full, a fully tailor-made consultancy report just for you. Of course, that is not feasible. So we have tried to make a trade-off between what was feasible, both for us as researchers and for you as a municipality, to provide to use the tool. So that's why we tried to limit the amount of details and the amount of information that we require. But the idea is that based on that, we can make distinctions in what kind of measures we think work for your type of city and which ones do not. Okay, so far for this tool. Maybe we can already have like 2 or 3 minutes to ask questions about this specific tool, if you have any. Otherwise, you might have forgotten them after the survey. Are there any questions about this tool now? About how it works, about how you can use it, about what's in it?
Is Luxembourg the only city in this country to is mentioned on the site?
I have not been able to check all of them, I'm afraid. So I would like to invite you to check. I don't know that much about Luxembourg, but I started with looking at the biggest one because I was quite sure that would be in it. I would say cities below 10,000 inhabitants, chance is quite small that they will be in the database. Somewhere between 10 and 50,000, it's a bit iffy, I'm not sure. And all cities over 50,000, most of them should at least be in the database. Yep. Any other questions? Okay, very good. If there are no more questions, I will continue with the rest of the survey. But if you have any more questions by the end of the presentation about the tool, feel free to ask them then. Okay, since we have heard that we should walk more, I will start walking now that I'm no longer stuck to my mouse of the computer. So I'm going to begin with the results of the survey. So the idea was that we have a survey about people's motivations to use active modes. And by active modes, we mean walking, cycling, and usage of what we call personal e-transporters, electric micro-mobility devices. I will show some examples of those devices in a minute. And we have done this survey in 9 European cities. Of course, not coincidentally, they were located in the countries where the partners were located in. But for Belgium, we conducted a survey with inhabitants of the city of Liège and Ghent. In the Netherlands, we had Tilburg and Groningen. In Germany, Düsseldorf, Dortmund, and Berlin. And in Norway, we had the cities of Bergen and Trondheim. The idea was to, in general, collect mid-sized, information about mid-sized cities, which of course doesn't apply to Berlin, but there are other reasons to add Berlin as an extra city. And we have interrogated 250 respondents per city. So it was a representative sample of respondents based on age and gender. So it was quite a task to collect so much data with so much strict limitations in terms of the city they live in and so on and so on. About these personal e-transporters, these are the types of devices that we mean. Most popular nowadays, of course, is the electric scooter, trottinette in French. I'm not sure what it's in German, but I'm not sure if it's that important. I think you know what I mean. So most important or most popular nowadays are these electric scooters. You also see them pop up as shared devices in many bigger cities nowadays. Like in Brussels, there are like 5 or 6 companies that showed up just in the last year. It's quite crazy. This is also a very interesting one, a monowheel. Not sure. Have you ever seen that? It looks very futuristic. Just somebody standing on some steps, and he has like one big wheel between his legs, and he goes surprisingly fast and handy with it. Usually, I tried it. I'm not that handy with it yet. But I think you get the idea, like these types of electric personal devices that you can use to travel like a couple of kilometers. One of the things we asked to people is what they think are the most important obstacles for them that hinder them from cycling more frequently. So what are the things that keep them from using their bike more often? And we begin with the mean results. So we distinguish between the obstacles of physical effort, time, costs, the environment. And by environment, we don't mean like, green hippie style of environment. We mean the physical environment where they live in terms of climate and in terms of hilliness and so on. And finally, traffic safety. So what we found in the results, the differences don't seem that big on the graph, but they are all statistically significantly different. So we found that the most important obstacle for people that hinders them from cycling more is actually traffic safety. That was the biggest obstacle for most people. You can see that it's, that the physical effort and the time and the environment, they are all substantially less important to people. Costs is, of course, the least important concern for biking because it's in general not a very expensive mode of transportation. So in that sense, it's very good that more and more attention is being spent to the fact that mobility and safety need to go hand in hand. Also, the topic of the European Mobility Week, it also stresses this importance. And I mean, I'm not being paid by European Mobility Week to tell that. It just comes from our survey that traffic safety is the most important barrier for people to cycle more. But this is just on average. If we look at the different cities, this is of course a huge load of data, but I walk you through it. Then we can see there are very clear differences between the different cities. And the most distinct difference is again in terms of traffic safety. We can see that in the Dutch cities, for instance, and of course we all know the Netherlands are in terms of road safety and cycling safety way ahead of most other countries. We can see that for them, traffic safety is not that important actually as a consideration. Like in Tilburg, physical effort and time is more important than physical effort is equally important. And if we look at Groningen, it's even, you know, the least important consideration apart from costs. And that is, of course, in strong contrast with, for instance, cities like Berlin and Liège, where you can very clearly see that it's by far the most important barrier prohibiting people from cycling more. We also looked at walking, and here we can see a very different view. Well, first of all, we can see that in general the values of the barriers are a bit lower. So in general, people perceive less barriers to walking compared to cycling. But we can see very clearly, very distinct, that the most important obstacle for people to walk more is time. I'm not going to argue whether walking is a fast mode or a slow mode, because that was a tricky discussion, I think. But the idea is that people think that they don't have the time to walk, or that walking takes too much time. So if we want to encourage walking, that would be a very important thing to work on. And if we look at the different cities, we can see that there is not that strong difference in terms of that. We can see that, well, for instance, in Liège, safety is also a quite big concern for walking, but in general, walking is considered probably a bit more safe than cycling because it's not that strong of a barrier. But it's very clear that in most of the cities, time is by far the most important obstacle for walking. So we will need to work on that if we want to encourage walking, make it a faster mode by comparison. One thing we try to do, we try to make a very complicated analysis. It's called factor cluster analysis. I'm not going to bore you with what it is, but the idea is that it tries to distinguish groups of people who are, on terms of psychological factors related to transportation, think very alike. And we had more than 2,000 people in our survey, and the software only came up with just 2 clusters of people. There was the pro-cycling cluster and the not pro-cycling cluster. I'm not going to say an anti-cycling cluster because it's not that these people are against cycling, but it was very clear that one group had very favorable opinions and ideas about cycling and the other one did not. So that's why we labeled them pro-cycling and not pro-cycling. And they are almost 50-50. There's 56% of people in general were considered to be part of a pro-cycling cluster and 44% of the not pro-cycling cluster. It turned out that there were no clear clusters related to walking. This means that when it comes to cycling, people have more pronounced opinions. They, you know, you're in favor of it or you're not. While walking, it does not, for some reason, create that strong opinions with people. And of course that makes sense because to some extent everybody's a walker, even if it's just from the parking lot to the front door. But everybody walks from time to time, while not everyone cycles from time to time. So walkers are like more homogeneous, like everyone is more or less okay with it, and cycling not. So that was a quite surprising finding in our view. Now, what are the characteristics of these pro-cycling people? And of course, then we know by default also what the characteristics of the non-pro-cycling people are. Of course, we found that Dutch people in general were much more pro-cycling, so they were much more frequent in that pro-cycling cluster. And we found very few ones from Liège and Bergen, which we also found to be the cities where people cycled least. There were more young people, more men. In general, they had a higher education level. And perhaps the most surprising, they were not more pro-environmental than the people in the other cluster. So it's not that they are cycling because they think it's so important for the environment. They just cycle because they like it, they think it's an efficient and convenient way, they think it's cheap, whatever, but it's not because they are, in general, more pro-environmental. We also see that the pro-cycling cluster in general has more subscriptions to public transport, to car sharing systems, to bicycle sharing systems. But, surprisingly enough, there was no difference in bicycle possession. There was a slight difference in car ownership, so the people from the pro-cycling cluster in general own slightly less cars, but it was a very small difference, like maybe 8 or 9%. And of course, this is in part compensated by the fact that they more often have subscriptions to car sharing. So it's also not that these people are by default that they don't own a car or that they cannot afford a car. It's also quite interesting to see. And we could see that it's not only cycling that they do more often, but they actually make use of all, and I put it between air quotes, alternative modes. All non-car modes is perhaps a better word. So we could see that they were more frequently cycling, obviously. They were more frequently walking. They made more use of mopeds and motorcycles. They make more use of public transport. They make more use of taxis. They make more use of these personal e-transporters, these electric devices. And more often, they are, just occasional car drivers or car passengers. They don't drive their car every day, but they do it from time to time. While in the other cluster, you much more had all the, let's say, die-hard car users who use their car every day, which of course is not surprising. Then we also compared how they performed in terms of, or what they answered, I should say, about these obstacles to cycle more. So you can see them again: physical effort, time, costs, environment, traffic safety. First of all, people from the not pro-cycling cluster, they were more susceptible to physical effort. They found physical effort a bigger problem. Quite interesting is that in terms of time, there was no difference between the two groups. So it doesn't matter if you're in favor of cycling or not in favor of cycling, you consider the time an equally important obstacle for cycling more. The pro-cycling cluster was more susceptible to costs for cycling. We think that this is because, because they are already quite pro-cycling and they already cycle quite a lot. It might be that they think that they will need substantial investments in order to cycle even more. Perhaps they need a cargo bike because they want to go to stores by bike and they don't think it's usable with their regular bike, or they want an electric bike or a speed pedelec because they want to do further trips by bike as well. So that's what we think is the motivation behind it. The not pro-cycling cluster was also more susceptible to the physical environment, so the climate, the hilliness of the area was also more important to them. And finally, and most importantly, they were by far much more susceptible to this problem of traffic safety. So traffic safety was considered by both groups a substantial problem for cycling more, but it was by far the biggest obstacle for people in the not pro-cycling cluster. So if these are the people we want to target, the people who are not very much in favor of cycling yet, or who don't cycle that often yet, then it's even more important that we start working on this issue of safety for cyclists. very quickly, we also checked this very common theory, the theory of planned behavior. It's basically a very well-known theory that tries to explain behavior. So the idea is that people's attitudes, what they think of a specific behavior, like cycling or walking, influence their intention to do that behavior, and then of course the intention to do a behavior will hopefully ultimately result in actually doing the behavior. So the attitudes are one important consideration. Then you have subjective norm, which basically means what they think other people think about this behavior. So your subjective norm about cycling is what you think your friends and your family and your other significant others think about you cycling, whether they think it's a good thing or a bad thing. And finally, perceived behavioral control relates to your confidence in being able to do this. Do you feel confident of cycling in your environment? And we found that for both walking and cycling, the attitudes was by far the most important determinant. It had twice as strong correlation, that was twice as strong with intention compared to the subjective norm, for instance. So if we want to encourage walking and cycling, we want to, or we need to work on people's attitudes, people's opinions on walking and cycling. And of course, not surprisingly, part of these attitudes also relate to if you think it's a safe transport mode. Very quickly about these personal e-transporters. We asked people how often they use these devices. Of course, and I can see that the black is not very well visible, but I think the size of the blocks tell the message. Of course, by far the majority of people have never ever used these devices. We conducted a survey in June last year. If we do it today, these percentages will probably be substantially lower already because it's very rapidly evolving. But in general, like 80 or 90% of people have never used it before, and in Norway it's even higher. But on the other hand, if we look at the upper side of the graph, we can still see that there is a substantial amount of people, especially in the Netherlands and in Germany, who already use these devices. You know, like 3 to 5% of people who indicate that they use it regularly. Like not just a few times per year, because that you can see that as a bit more of a gimmick, but actually use it in their everyday travel. So that's quite it's quite remarkable to see that this is not really a marginal phenomenon. It's really booming, and you can see that from people's reported behavior. However, in general, we see, and here we have again a comparable graph, with the lowest, the closer to zero, the lower the perception, and the higher the perception. We asked people what they think of these personal e-transporters. So we asked them, do you think it's a fast mode of transport? Do you think it's convenient? Do you think it's a fashionable or cool way of transportation? Do you think it's safe? Do you think it's a cheap way of transportation? And do you think it's pleasant or fun to do? And in general, this is not a very high score because, it's asked on a Likert scale ranging from 1 to 7, which means that 4 is the neutral value. So basically, this means that on general, people have a rather negative view of these devices. The most positive scores were for fast and for pleasant and fun. So people think it's quite fast and quite pleasant. But the lowest scores are for safety and for price. So they think it's a very dangerous mode of transportation, and we can't blame them for it. But that's a different study, a different story. And they also think it's not a very cheap way of transportation, which is to some extent true. But of course, if you compare it with other devices like a car, you can argue about this. And then we again looked at the very different cities, and of course, not surprisingly, we see that the cities where less people already use them, like the Norwegian cities, they have lower IDs about these devices than, for instance, the German cities where they are more common. I'm going to speed up a little bit, but this is already quite close to the end. don't worry, we will get to lunch soon. We tried to fit a stage model, and the stage model basically tries to predict in what stage of behavioral change people are. And the behavioral change we investigated is if they want to change to using these personal e-transporters, if they want to start using these devices. And there are basically 5 stages, and they go from pre-contemplation, which basically means I've never ever considered even using that device, to contemplation, which means like, yeah, I mean, I'm not using it, but I'm considering it. When it comes to preparation, they are actively preparing to start making change to that mode. Action means that they are already starting to use that device, and maintenance means that they have already been doing it for quite a while, so it's quite a stable behavior now for them. So the idea was that we try to identify what characteristics of people affect this stage. So to put it in a different way, what kind of people are more likely to start using these devices than others? And we found that people who have higher cycling norms, surprisingly enough, will use these devices more often. So people who think that other people think that cycling is a good thing, they will use these devices more often. This could indicate that they see it as something comparable to cycling, maybe. I'm not sure. A bit more clear or obvious is that people with higher perceived obstacles hindering cycling are in general in a higher stage. So that means that people who think that there are important obstacles to cycling, like the safety or like the climate, the hilliness of the area and so on, when they think it's a bigger problem, they are more likely to start using personal e-transporters. People who walk more frequently, they are also more susceptible to start using these devices. Perhaps that's also related to, opportunity for trips. People who walk more, they make lots of short trips, and these personal e-transporters are, of course, also targeting shorter trips, say from a few hundred meters up to maybe 5 kilometers. But people with higher walking attitudes are less susceptible. So people who like to walk, they're not going to change. They like to walk because they like the activity in itself. So they are not very likely to change to these personal e-transporters instead. Of course, people with strong transport mode habits are not likely to change. And people who have a subscription to a bike sharing system are also less likely. So that means that there is, to some extent, some cannibalism between bike sharing systems and these personal e-transporters, which kind of makes sense because these sharing systems, they often are used as a first or last mile solution in combination with public transport, for instance. So they kind of aim at the same types of trips. To round up, a few conclusions. Cyclists and pedestrians are not the same. This sounds as the most trivial statement of the day, but try to think about it. How often are you talking about active modes as like one group of people? How often are policymakers or studies or whoever talking about active transport modes as if it's one group of people? They're not. They're very different from each other, and if we want to stimulate them, we want to focus on the things that are important to them. For cycling, that is road safety, as indicated. Road safety is very important, and especially for the people who are not very much in favor of cycling today, which are usually the ones we want to focus on, they are very susceptible to this feeling that cycling is an unsafe activity. Of course, time and physical effort and the climate, etc., also play a role, and we think that e-bikes are very important in that respect, because electric bikes, they will, in general, slightly increase your average speed. They will, reduce the physical effort that's needed and so on. So they can have a very strong and very important contribution to improving cycling. But again, it will be important that we take into account that it doesn't lead to unsafety. For walking, the main obstacle is time. And we can argue whether that's justified or not, but it is what it is. And if we want to make walking a faster mode by comparison, we can focus on several things. We can focus on direct roads, create shortcuts for walkers, create good crossability of roads, low waiting times. We can work on land use planning, densification of areas, mixed land use, etc. Those are all things that will improve or will encourage walking. So time is the most important thing there. Cycling and walking attitudes are very important to behavioral change, so it's very important that all of us keep working on, improving people's views on walking and cycling as an activity. We want to keep telling them that this is a good thing and that it's a very useful transport mode for many, many reasons. And finally, the personal e-transporters, they are a very important opportunity as a first and last mile solution. And for interurban trips, but at the moment, people still have quite unfavorable opinions on them. And they mostly think that safety and cost are an issue. And to some extent they are, because those of you who have used these devices know that sometimes they can be quite dangerous by design, and the design and legislation of around these devices still needs to improve. Now I have already crossed dinner time, so I'm going to wrap up here. Also, my voice is telling me that it is about time that we stop. But I want to give you the opportunity to ask like 1 or 2 final questions. And of course, during lunch, feel free to ask me. Any urgent questions right now? Or very hungry, of course. Oh, I see a hand at the end. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that is a very valid point. Safety and security are 2 different points, but they are often very mixed. And people also consider it a bit as like one concept. So to some extent, I think it is present in this concept. But security is indeed a very important element. Also, when we were building the pet bike planner database, for instance, we found that bicycle parkings are extremely important, not just for convenience of people, but also to prevent bicycle theft, because I think it was like 1 in 10 bikes that get stolen never get replaced. So that basically means that these people just give up. They stop cycling because their bike was stolen, so they're fed up with it. So I very much agree with you that security is a very important element. But of course, it will be more important in areas and in cities that generally have more criminality than others. Yeah. Yes. Well, we couldn't include it to that extent. We basically asked the people, to what extent do you think cost is an important barrier for you to cycle more or to walk more? And of course, nobody said, yeah, it's a major obstacle for walking more. That makes sense, of course. But for cycling, there were some who considered it to some extent a barrier. And as indicated, I think that relates to the fact that for some people who are already quite commonly used to cycling, it would need them to upgrade to more expensive or more diverse types of bicycles. So, but yeah, of course, by default, we think that cycling is in general a very low cost transport mode, especially compared to car use, of course, but perhaps also compared to public transport. It of course depends on the type of subscription or ticket you prefer. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.